What is up, YouTube? Welcome back today. Today we are working on the Browning AB3, and I decided to make a video on how to remove or disassemble the bolt on the AB3. It is different than any of the other A bolts, and it is the exact same or similar to the Winchester XPR. They are basically very similar rifles, and they are designed by the same company. They're owned by Olin Corporation. So let's dive into the disassembly of the Browning AB3 bolt. All right, so starting out, you're going to need to have a way to retain the firing pin here. And the way I'm going to do that is with a vise. Now, this is probably the best way to do it. You should probably have a vise if you're working on bolt guns. So I would just say probably stick with this, but I believe there is a tool that you can use to remove tension off of this. But your hardest portion is going to come when you're going to actually need to pull this firing pin back and rotate it in order to move this cap. So let's get started on that, and I'll show you what I mean. Alright, so I'm going to try and do this with one hand, but essentially the first thing we're going to need to do is remove this cover. This cover is just protecting any debris from falling down into the bolt or getting into the mechanism here. So in order to do that, we need to make sure our firing pin is tight inside our vise here, and we're able to spin this bolt past the vise. So I'm going to pull onto the bolt. You can see it here. I'm going to get it into the half position, basically the bolt sticking halfway up. And you should be able to basically release this now, and this cover will come off. All right. To get a better angle of this, I'm just going to show you how this cover comes off. It's going to slide straight back now. And what's holding this cover on is part of this firing pin channel here, retainer here. It has a beveled lip, so that needs to be completely down in order for this to slide on and off. So this will just slide right off. All right, from here I'm going to rotate the bolt back to its normal position here in the uncocked position. And you'll be able to tell that because the firing pin will be protruding, if you can see that there. So that is the correct position. Now we're going to need to actually push on the back of this here to get the charging handle out. So we'll get this repositioned. All right, so we can see I have the bolt retained now inside the center of the jaw here. I typically use a little Scotch-Brite pad as padded jaws. It's always worked pretty well for me. So only thing you're going to really need to do from this point is remove tension off of this bolt handle. So there still is a little bit of tension even though the firing pin is basically decharged. We're going to need to push in on this little section right here. So you can see I've taken my hammer and pushed that in, and then your bolt should pop right out, and you can see it's already started. Now with one hand I'm not going to be able to do this task completely, but let me show you what it'll look like when it's done. So with the bolt completely removed, or the charging handle completely removed here, it just slides right out like that. Once the tension is off of it, and the firing pin will come out, and your job is done. So let's say you want to remove your firing pin spring and replace it. Now this one does not need to be removed, so I'm not going to, but it's pretty straightforward to show you how to do this. Essentially, you're going to remove the roll pin that's right here, and then this little section is going to pop off of the firing pin itself. And then you'll be able to remove this retainer, the spring retainer, and replace the spring. And then essentially reverse order, put the spring on in the correct manner, and then you're going to put the retainer on, and then put the cross section of this bolt here that actually interfaces with the trigger mechanism. Put that back on, and your bolt's going to be back together, or your firing pin is going to be back together, and you're going to be able to insert this back into the bolt. Okay, reassembly of your bolt is going to happen in reverse order. You're going to put the firing pin back in, and this is hard to do while looking at the camera, and make sure it's completely inserted, and you should see it resting in, come on, focus. You should see it resting in the channel here as far forward as it can possibly go. And then from here, basically, reverse process, you need to drive this retainer in to remove some of the spring tension in order to fit your charging handle back up into the bolt. and I will show you what that looks like here in a second. So once you have that retainer drove in, come on focus, drove in, then you should be able to push the charging handle back up in. Now this is not all the way seated. I wanted you to be able to see kind of how that lines up and goes in there. So if you are struggling to put the charging handle back in, most likely it's due to the retainer is not oriented in the correct position. So if you're struggling to drive the charging handle back in, make sure you rotate this retainer. Most likely it's going to need to come this way, or it's going to need to go clockwise. So rotate it a little bit clockwise and then try again. So this is how the retainer should look in comparison to the firing pin to drive that charging handle back in. So I'm going to go ahead and put the charging handle back in, and we'll move to the next step. From here, we're going to need to just put the plastic cover back on that protects all these components here. So from there, your charging handle should be all the way forward and seated, and then this retainer should be protruding out quite a bit compared to what it looked like before when the charging handle was like halfway in. So if it's sucked up into the bolt, you most likely don't have the charging handle seated all the way. So from here, we're going to put it back in the vise so we can rotate the firing pin and get this cover back on. From here, we're just going to pull back and rotate until we get to about that halfway position, which that should be close. From here, you can fine tune it on the bench. Now I'm going to pull back out of the vise, put the plastic cover back on, and then put it back in the vise to rotate it back. So like I was saying before, this cover should just slide on, so I've got it manipulated in the vise so that this will work. This cover should slide completely on and butt up against the face of the rear of the bolt. Now, from here, you should be able to just rotate this, and it should retain that plastic piece. Now with one hand, I'm not sure if that did. Looks like it did. All right, so from here, the bolt is back together, and you should be able to tell because the firing pin should be protruding. If the firing pin is not protruding, it is not in the correct orientation. In order to put this back into the gun though, we're going to need to pull back and rotate and get it into its locked position. That should pull the firing pin back. So you should not be able to see the firing pin anymore. And I will show you what that looks like on the bottom of the bolt. In order to put the bolt back into the gun, you're going to need to remove or put the firing pin in the position in which it is not recessed into this groove. So it's going to need to be rotated back and into this little pocket here. Let's rotate the light a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. That's what it should look like. This should slide completely into the bolt or into the gun with no problems. You should be able to reseat it and make sure it works. So from there, let's go and throw this back into the gun. All right, now we're going to put the bolt back into the gun and check and make sure it functions. So this button right here on the side is going to need to be pressed on the AB3, obviously, to put this back in here. So I'm going to put the bolt back in, and we'll do a little bit of a test and function. Once your bolt is installed, now we're going to check for fit and function here. So we're going to slide the bolt to the rear or forward and to the rear a couple times, make sure there's no binding there. We're going to rotate the bolt with it cocked so that we can make sure there's no binding in that process. Both of those check out. Now we're going to test fire. We know the gun's clear because we've extracted them multiple times. Now we're going to test fire, make sure the firing pin comes forward, check the charging of the weapon, make sure that there's no binding there. Everything seems to be working good, and we're good to go. So from there, that is your bolt disassembly and reassembly on the Browning AB3. Very similar to the Winchester XPR. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I will try and answer them for you guys. With that, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.